You hear about heists, right? But this one was so audacious, so brilliantly planned, it became an absolute legend. It's a story about an inside tip, some brutal efficiency, and one tiny, fatal mistake. This is the story of the Great Train Robbery.
So picture the scene. It's the dead of night and a Royal Mail train is speeding from Glasgow to London. Then suddenly, in the middle of nowhere, a single red signal glows in the darkness. Now for the driver, this is bizarre, a puzzle he just can't solve. But this isn't some simple malfunction. Oh no.
You say this stop wasn't on any schedule. It was the very first move in a meticulous ambush, a trap that had been set for months, and it was all triggered by one single doctored traffic light.
So the driver, a man named Jack Mills, brings the whole train to a halt. His assistant driver hops out to use the line-side emergency phone, to report the strange signal, and that's when he finds the first real sign of trouble. The line's been cut. Before the assistant can even figure out what's going on, these figures just emerge from the darkness and grab him. At that exact same moment, the engine cabin is completely swarmed. And when Jack Mills tries to resist, he's hit hard over the head with an iron bar. And just like that, the train is theirs.
So you've got to be asking yourself, how in the world did this gang know exactly when and where to strike? Well, to understand that, we have to go back a bit. Because this wasn't random, not at all. This was the result of a perfectly orchestrated inside job.
The guy behind the whole operation was a pretty well-known London criminal, Bruce Reynolds. But even he couldn't have pulled this off without his secret weapon, an anonymous source, someone high up inside the Royal Mail, whose identity, by the way, is still a mystery.
So this source gave Reynolds the scoop on a very, very specific target, the HVP, or High Value Packages Coach. You can basically think of it as a rolling bank vault on the train, moving huge amounts of cash around the country. And this, right here, was the insider's first critical tip. See, most of these HVP coaches had just been fitted with brand new security alarms, but the insider knew that on this specific night, the main coach was out of action, so they'd be using an old reserve coach instead, a coach with no alarm system at all.
Now, normally, the haul from one of these coaches would be somewhere around £300,000. I mean, that's a massive score on its own for sure, but it is nothing compared to what was really coming.
And this was tip number 2. The insider let them know that because it was just after a long bank holiday weekend, the banks had sent back a gigantic surplus of cash. The amount on the train that night wasn't $300,000, it was £3 million. A tenfold increase. This was the score of a lifetime.
Okay, so with the perfect target and the perfect opportunity, the gang was ready to go. Back on that railway line, their intricate plan was about to kick off in the middle of the night.
Their plan was just ruthlessly efficient. They uncoupled the engine and that HVP coach from the rest of the train. Now, they had actually brought their own retired train driver, but he was totally baffled by the modern controls. So, in a pinch, they had to force the injured Jack Mills to drive the shortened train 1 kilometer down the track to a spot called Bridego Bridge where their getaway truck was waiting. From there, they stormed the carriage, easily overpowering the postal staff inside.
Working against the clock, they formed a human chain, passing down 120 mailbags stuffed with cash. The total weight was an unbelievable 2.5 tons. I mean, they moved so fast that in just 15 minutes they loaded almost everything, leaving only 8 bags behind in their rush to get out of there.
As they were getting ready to leave, one of the robbers yelled a final threat to the terrified staff who were tied up inside the coach. He told them not to move for half an hour. It was just a throwaway line, meant to make sure they had a clean getaway. But that one sentence, it would be their undoing.
The gang sped away from that bridge, millions of pounds richer, absolutely convinced they had just pulled off the perfect crime. But their celebration at a remote farmhouse hideout, well, that was going to be cut very short.
Their destination was a place called Leather Slade Farmhouse, a secluded property about 43 kilometers from the crime scene. The plan was pretty simple. Split up the loot and just wait for the heat to die down before they all slipped away.
Feeling flush with success, they felt completely untouchable. So, to pass the time while they waited, they made an incredibly arrogant choice. They broke out a Monopoly board and played with the real stolen money.
But back at the crime scene, police were interviewing the postal staff, and that 30-minute warning gave investigators a critical piece of the puzzle. They figured that in that amount of time, the
The robbers could only have traveled within a 50-kilometer radius. Suddenly, a huge nationwide search became a focused hunt, and Leatherslade Farmhouse was right in the middle of it. Now the gang was listening to a police scanner, and they heard that the search area was closing in around them, and they panicked. The plan to lay low for days turned into a frantic dash to escape, and in their hurry, they got sloppy.
5 days later, a neighbor who knew about the massive reward being offered tipped off the police about all the strange activity at the farmhouse. When the police raided the now abandoned property, they found mailbags, money wrappers, and that Monopoly set. The gang had tried to wipe down most of the surfaces, but they'd completely missed the game board and the pieces, which were now covered in their fingerprint.
And here's the thing, since most of the gang were career criminals, their fingerprints were already on file. That Monopoly board became a treasure trove of evidence for Scotland Yard. They quickly matched the prints, and within weeks, 14 of the 16 known gang members were arrested.
The captured robbers were all sentenced to 30 years in prison for a crime that absolutely shocked the nation. But for the driver, Jack Mills, the consequences were far more devastating. The head injury he got during the attack left him with lasting trauma. He never drove a train again and sadly died just 7 years later.
You know, the robbery left a permanent mark, not just on the people involved, but on the landscape itself. The site of the heist, Bridego Bridge, is still known today by its informal name, Train Robbers Bridge.
And so the whole gang was brought to justice by a fingerprint on a board game. But that leaves us with one final tantalizing question. The robbers were caught, but the one person who made the whole thing possible, the senior Royal Mail source who gave them the perfect plan and then just vanished, was never identified. Who was the insider? That remains the greatest secret of the crime of the century.